Welcome back to the Monday Morning Point Guard podcast. On today's episode, on today's episode, definitely some major shakeups to a few teams' rotations. Some teams, like the Nets and the Knicks, did that voluntarily, whereas in the case of the Miami Heat and the Denver Nuggets, they were kind of forced into that by injury. If you do end up liking the video, please, leave us a like, drop us a comment. And subscribe. I'm going to be doing this weekly with some news updates or just topics that I find interesting. And then if there's any topics that you would like me to discuss, just leave a comment. Be happy to talk about it. I'm going to start out with my team, the Miami Heat. Bam Adebayo injured next 4 to 6 weeks. Just first couple games of that have not looked very good. We've also been missing Jimmy Butler to a bruised tailbone, but it sounds like he'll be back here Monday. This team just it doesn't have a lot of depth, particularly at the center spot. You basically got Dwayne Dedman, and he's fine as a backup and kind of in lesser minute roles and not playing a ton and just little 5-minute spurts, 6-minute spurts here and there. Really great hustle guy, and I like him for that role. But now that he's having to play a lot more minutes, it just really shows his limitations as a player. And then also we don't really have any wing depth here. Like once Jimmy Butler's out of the lineup, you've got Morris, who's also out of the lineup. Caleb Martin has been like a real surprise and a bright spot. I mean, he's only 6'5", though. It looks like he's bigger when he's out there, but listed at 6'5". So I guess if you include him in like the wing category as opposed to a guard, that's a little bit of depth there. But it's just not been good, particularly without Jimmy and now without Bam. So they're kind of having to make adjustments on the fly. I think when Victor Oladipo comes back, that'll help add to the depth, but I'm still a little concerned that this team just is not going to be able to, not going to be capable of weathering any injuries or any interruptions to like what they would like to do, in the rotation. Also, just huge concerns about Duncan Robinson. He's just not been good for them this year. You're talking 36% on field goals, 33% on threes. It's just not good enough for a guy who that's basically all that he can do. He's not going to be a guy that's able to really attack the basket effectively. And he's a huge liability on defense. They're still rolling him out there in the starting lineup every game, trying to get him those opportunities, but it just looks like he's lost all confidence in the jump shot. His feet aren't set. He's not really getting a good base on the jump shot. He just looks uncomfortable out there. And we really need him to be like back at the level we've seen him in the last 2 years in order for this team to be really successful. A lot of Heat fans are throwing around Max Strus is a possible replacement in the starting lineup. He's at 45% field goals, 40% on threes. So, really a lot more solid than Duncan Robinson. If we were to do that, he's not the shooter that a peak level Duncan Robinson is. He's not going to be the guy you could run off a million screens and catch and shoot threes off balance. And, in a catch and shoot where he's open, he's lethal, but none of the really high degree of difficulty threes. It doesn't seem like he has those yet. But with some positives for him, he's a lot better at finishing around the basket. It seems like, he got up and dunked on somebody the other night. He's got some crafty finishes around the hoop. He's not a total liability on defense. He's just built a little bit more stocky, so he doesn't get pushed around as much. So he might be an option. And what I think they should do with Duncan to just kind of get his confidence back and his mojo is just next time we have a longer, road trip, just keep him at home, say body soreness, illness, whatever you want to say. Just leave him in Miami for that road trip and just have him come in the gym every day and just do some drills to get, his balance back and his jump shot and just kind of get the confidence back in it. So that way, when they come back from the road trip, he's ready to go. I think just continually carting him out there into the starting lineup and having him take some really high degree of difficulty threes to start games. And, once he misses those, it's like the life leaves his body. He just doesn't have the confidence anymore. So hopefully the Heat can weather the storm. Right now they're 14-10, which is good enough for fourth in the East. The East is just incredibly competitive this year. Both conferences really are. You know, if things really bottom out here in the next month without Adebayo, you know, we could be in like play-in territory very easily, very quickly. So you know, last 10 games they're 5-5, so they're kind of holding it together, I guess, but not really. It's just not. It's not been great without Bam, and you know, certainly without Jimmy as well. You know, anytime you're missing your top two players, it's just going to look ugly. Now moving on to the other team, you know, Bam's injury, while significant, not nearly as significant as the Michael Porter Jr. injury for the Nuggets. It just what a disaster it is for them. I'm glad for him that he got his big contract signed before this happened, but it does suck if you're a Nuggets fan or, you know, the Nuggets organization, because they just committed through 2027 to this guy on a max contract slot. And, you know, he just had back surgery. Now, you know, maybe that's not as big of a concern if he didn't fall in the draft because of that. You know, when he was drafted in the 2018 draft. So huge concern. I mean, he was the number one player in high school and he dropped to like barely a lottery pick to Denver. A lot of teams, you know, just considered him just undraftable because of his medical issues. You know, he was considered a risk for Denver to take, but it was a risk they could afford to take, you know, being a lot later in the draft. Now that they've committed to him financially, this could end up being a complete, you know, disaster. Right now they're 11-11, which is seventh in the West. They are in the mix for the fourth seed, you know, kind of like I had mentioned with the East. Everything is very like flat. There's not, you know, you got the Warriors, the Suns, and the Jazz who are at the top, and they're pretty comfortably at the top. But really 4 through 11 are all within a game or two of each other. And then even the Spurs at the 12th spot, you know, they're not too far out of things. It's not until you get to like 13 and 14 in the West that, you know, those teams are just completely out of it and obviously out of it. Just kind of, you know, I'll look back through a couple of back injuries just to kind of get some context for Michael Porter Jr. And it doesn't look great. It just historically, they're just not, you know, it just doesn't look great for him. Bird hurt his back in 85 doing some yard work around his house. He ends up retiring in the 92 season at age 35. You know, I wasn't alive to watch Larry Bird live, but from everything I read, it sounded like after the back injury, he was just not quite the same player. Like if you looked at his basketball reference page, he's still putting up numbers, but it sounds like from the people who were watching it, you know, it just didn't ever look quite the same. Larry Johnson is a really prominent example of this. I think he's potential Hall of Fame guy, super explosive athlete, hurts the back in like the 94 season, I think. And he's just kind of never the same player. He ends up having to kind of reshape the way that he plays, and he leans more on shooting towards the back half of his career, but he still only has a 10-year career, and the back pain ends up kind of forcing him out of the league and forcing him to retire. You know, that was a guy that probably could have played 15 years or even more if he hadn't gotten hurt with the back stuff. And, you know, it was a pretty steep drop off in production, you know, once the back injury happened or once it kind of, you know, really took hold of his career. A little bit of good news, Steve Nash struggled with back issues pretty much his whole career. It's ultimately what ended his career. You know, that his 18th season in the league was with the Lakers, and he barely played that season because kind of forced out of the league by retirement. But for 17 years, he was really productive and was able to manage those back issues. So that's some good news for Michael Porter Jr. fans or Nuggets fans. The tough thing for them, you know, this season specifically, you know, they're in the Jokic prime here, and they really need to capitalize on that with you know, Jokic last year MVP level, or was the MVP. This year he's been even, you know, better than he was last year. So we're in the prime of his career. He's a generational, you know, talent, and looks to be, you know, probably the best passing center of all time. I've heard Bill Walton was pretty good at that, but you know, some of the passes he makes are just incredible. The scoring, Defense has been really good this year for him, and it just stinks because now without Jamal Murray and without Porter Jr., it's going to be tough for him to kind of keep the ship afloat here. If he can, like I said, they're kind of in the mix for the 4th seed. I got to imagine he's MVP again. I mean, with Aaron Gordon as your second best player and that, being not particularly close for the other guys, I guess Monte Morris is in the mix for next best player for them. Um, yeah, if he's able to keep the ship afloat and get them to like a home court in the first round of the playoffs, I got to imagine he's MVP. Yeah, just really sad stuff. Hopefully, Michael Porter Jr. out for this season at least. Hopefully he can come back next year. And, hopefully it's just a bump in the road for him and not, something that's going to drastically alter the trajectory of his career. But it's just scary stuff if you're, a Nuggets fan and or a Michael Porter Jr. fan. Yeah, moving on to the Nets now. So we're getting into the teams now that have kind of voluntarily made some rotation changes. They've removed Blake Griffin from the rotation. He was their starting center. It looks like it might be done for him. Like this might be pretty much it. I think he might be able to find, spot warm in the bench somewhere else after this season. Maybe 15 minutes a game at most for some team, but it just didn't look good. The moment that really stuck out to me was during the Warriors game. The Warriors were basically just getting Curry or getting Griffin switched on to Curry, and watching Blake Griffin lumber around after Steph Curry was just sad to watch from a guy that was like a phenomenal athlete, earlier in his career. It was really, really sad looking. It looked like like an older dad, like racing after their toddler, the toddler is just like running laps around them. It was really bad. And, for Blake Griffin, 5 points, 5 rebounds on the season, 32% field goals and 16% on 3-pointers. If you're going to have Blake Griffin out there, he's not a great defender. He's got some playmaking, passing chops, and he's good at that, but you just need more efficiency out of him at that center spot for a Nets team. Like for field goals in particular, just overall, you expect him to be near the 50% mark because he should be getting wide open dunks off of, Kevin Durant and James Harden being out there. The 3-point percentage, I don't know. I think you'd be happy if it was in the 30s, but yeah, it wasn't good for him. And this is kind of the Nets' problem this season. Right now they're 16-7, which is first in the East, but the East is, they could drop to 4th or 5th easily if they go on a losing streak or one team gets really hot. And it's not out of the realm of possibilities that either James Harden or Durant would miss some games and they could go on that losing streak. Yeah, it's kind of their center situation is just not ideal. They're getting killed on the glass, and particularly in the losses. That Warriors game, the Warriors aren't a particularly big team, but they were just annihilating them on the boards. And Claxton, they're going to get him back at some point from this mystery illness that he has that's not COVID, but hasn't played since late October. So maybe that helps them, and maybe that's the center answer that they need. I'm not convinced that like Nick Claxton as like the primary center option. I'm fine with him in the rotation. I like him as a rotational piece, but like to be the predominant center option for them with, whatever's left of LaMarcus Aldridge, I just don't think that's going to be what they need come playoff time when you have to go up against Joel Embiid and Giannis. Like those two are just going to destroy them. It may not matter because the Nets may just score enough points to win, but I would be a little bit concerned about that. There are some center options out there that you can trade for, particularly now that they're listening to offers on Kyrie Irving. So it sounds like they're more willing to trade him now that, he's still not vaccinated, and it doesn't look like that's going to change. So the Indiana centers are, could be good options. I'm thinking more Miles Turner for them. So you could do like a Miles Turner and Levert for Kyrie. I don't think Indiana is interested in Kyrie, just with where they're at record wise this season. So you'd have to get a third team involved who would want Kyrie. And of the teams that would want Kyrie, I don't know that there are a ton out there that are willing to take on the headache of him, and also just him being maybe not available just with the his vaccination status. And also he just kind of takes these weird basketball hiatuses throughout the season, like he did one last year where he just kind of left the team and nobody on the team really knew why or when he was coming back. It's just tough for a team to kind of give up the type of assets it's going to take to trade for Kyrie Irving to get back a potential problem like that. Talent wise, I mean, he's one of the most skilled players in the league, flirting with the top 10 if, mentally he was engaged and checked in, but we've not seen that from him in a while. And so it's just tough. It's going to be tough for a team to give up a ton of assets for that. But I think Turner and Levert, if you were to do that package, you solve your center issues. You get one of the best shot blockers in the league, and you don't have to rely on Durant as much to, guard the interior. And I think that could be a good fit. He also shoots threes on the other end, spaces the floor really well, so you don't have to park him under the basket. And then Levert, they had, before they made the deal for James Harden so they could reunite with him. He was really good for the Nets, and he's a good scoring option. Just adds a little bit more punch than what they currently have. Obviously, if they would probably just rather have Kyrie than either of those two, but that doesn't seem to be an option right now. Minnesota is kind of the third in the 3-team trade, the third team that could be interested in making this happen. Edwards has been amazing this year. It looks like he's, kind of stepping into maybe an all-star caliber player, and it really looks like he could end up being very special. And then Towns, obviously still really good. One of the best centers in the league, probably the best offensive center in the league. Needs help on defense, and the Timberwolves are in the mix. I mean, right now they're in the 9th seed at 11 and 12. They could be looking to cash in, some of their picks. They don't really have a lot in the way of like young assets to trade to like a rebuilding team that they would want to give up. But, if you did a Kyrie and a Anthony Edwards backcourt, with Towns, I mean, that would be an insane offense. I mean, defensively, that would be pretty rough, but I think they would take that chance and try and figure it out. Obviously, they would have to unload D'Angelo Russell, and who wants him, I'm not sure. Christian Wood, also a good option for them at center, $14 million a year. I mean, the Rockets are going nowhere, and Christian Wood is a free agent after next season. I can't imagine he's going to be willing to sign on for the Rockets rebuilding situation, because they're years away from being a competitive team. So if they want to get some cash in on that asset, they could maybe get some picks back, maybe a young asset, depending on who would be involved in the deal with the Nets. I mean, they don't really have any young guys that they would be kind of wanting to give up or that the Rockets would be interested in. And that kind of moves on to the Knicks. I kind of mentioned them as like an obvious Kyrie destination, but they would be under the same guidelines as the Nets would with Kyrie. So it wouldn't really make sense, at least in this COVID world, for the Knicks to trade for Kyrie, but they are kind of primed to make a big move, and they really need to find like a playmaker. Kemba Walker was kind of supposed to be that solution, but they've removed him from the rotation. He just went from starting to out of the rotation completely for Thibodeau. And Alec Burks is going to be the replacement at point guard for them, which I found really kind of wild. So it looks like they're going to go Barrett and Burks as the backcourt. Neither of them are really point guards, particularly Alec Burks. He doesn't really have a lot of playmaking skills. He's a fine player as like a rotational piece, but I think we're relying on him as like a primary playmaking option. It's gonna be tough. Kemba Walker on the season, 12 points on 43% shooting, 41% from 3 on 5 attempts. So that's pretty good. Obviously, defensively, he's just a complete liability. The Knicks are kind of sputtering right now. They got off to a pretty good start to begin the season, but they're 11-12, which is 11th in the East. Don't overreact to being 11th in the East. I mean, as I mentioned, the Heat are in the 4th seed right now, tied for that at 14-10. The Bucks at 15-9 are the 3rd seed. So they're still in the mix, and they're certainly in the mix for a proper playoff spot and not having to deal with the play-in game. But there are some major concerns with their roster. Fournier has been an inconsistent shooter. Some games he's awesome, some games he's not. That's been, how he's been his whole career. So not really anything too surprising there. Randall has been kind of scoring wise, efficiency wise, it's definitely down from last year. The playmaking, the rebounding, it's all there like normal, but they're just the way they're kind of relying on him is just, it's tough for him. It's kind of a miscast role. He's been another one that's been complaining about the officiating this year, and I think he has some legitimate complaints. I mean, there's some drives he gets absolutely annihilated on and gets no call just because he's so big and strong. Like, it doesn't look, it's kind of like the Shaq, a miniature version of the Shaq problem. When Shaq played, it's hard to officiate him because he was so overpowering that like he would just get hammered in the paint and there'd be no call. He would always complain about it. But visually, eye test wise for an official, it's, it doesn't look like that really affected him at all. Randall kind of, to a lesser degree has that same problem. The idea, and for them, like, they're currently using Randall as like the focal point of the offense, which is fine, but he's having to create from the beyond the 3-point line for them, catching the ball at the top of the key and having to go off the dribble and create offense for them, because it's basically that and everybody kind of standing around for this offense. Like, I'm just not, I think Thibodeau is just kind of overrated as a coach. He plays guys into the ground throughout the regular season to get these wins, and it looks good. Last year he was coach of the year, but come playoff time, they're gassed. And at the end of the games, Randall looks like he needs an oxygen tank because he's played 43 minutes of the 45 minutes or something. Like, it's insane to me. Randall leading the team in assists at 5.3 a game, 2nd place, not particularly close in the threes. Like, that's not a recipe for success. So they are desperate for like an adult point guard in the building here, a guy who they can kind of rely on for playmaking so that they can get Randall into the post a little bit more. And Alec Burks is not the answer. So Kemba Walker, the idea of him would have been kind of the blueprint of success for them. Derrick Rose comes off the bench and they can kind of run the offense through him. But, at this stage in his career, he's a 6th man at best. And you really can't rely on him for heavy minutes like it seems like they need to. Their offense is just it gets really stagnant at times, and you saw it in the Bulls game. When last week when they're making shots, it's great, and they made a huge comeback in that game. But the way they got down so bad is the offense just becomes completely stagnant. There's some weird shot selection among some of the players, and they just have no ability to stop the bleeding when the team goes on a run. With the way they use Randall, he's an excellent scoring option, but when he has to take the ball basically up as the point guard and create offense off the dribble for them rather than get into the post and they feed it to him, that's just not going to work long term. And that was what we saw in the playoffs against the Hawks. They just didn't have enough scoring punch to get, to make a real run at them in the playoffs. And it's, a very similar roster this year. So this is a team that's kind of primed to make a trade, and they do have some young assets to kind of make that happen. They've got Obi Toppin, who I love, and it seems like they really like him, but he's just never going to get a ton of minutes with Julius Randle being there because they're very similar in their play style and the way they kind of want to operate. You've got Mitchell Robinson if they decide they want to give up on that. RJ Barrett, if they really want to push the chips in and get like a superstar level player, they could deal him. Kevin Knox is still young. I don't think anybody would really view him as much of an asset. I think they've still got a lot of their picks, so they've got some moves to make. If the Kings decide to blow it up, I think it's an obvious destination for De'Aaron Fox. I kind of talked about them last week and what they should do. I don't think they're going to trade De'Aaron Fox, but if they do, I think the Knicks should really go in for that. I think that would solve a lot of their problems. Shea Gilgeous-Alexander, if the Thunder are looking to deal him, I don't see that happening, but I have no idea what Sam Presti is doing over there. Maybe if the Knicks just offer a ton of draft picks, that would get him interested. CJ McCollum, if the Blazers decide to kind of move on from what they're doing, I think you'd have to get a third team involved for that, unless the Blazers are like completely blowing it up. If the Blazers are, end up wanting to trade Damian Lillard, then, they could throw the RJ Barrett or, the Obi Toppin into that deal and get something done for CJ. If not, you're going to have to get a third team involved to get Portland something that they feel like they can win with. Young players aren't really going to do it for them at this stage with Damian Lillard, 31 years old. They kind of need to capitalize on him right now. And then if the Knicks get really desperate, D'Angelo Russell is there. I think he would probably be available from the Timberwolves. I can't imagine they're particularly pleased with him. But maybe they are, because I know he's got a really close relationship with Towns. So maybe they're just keeping him around to keep that relationship happy. I don't know. I wouldn't trade for D'Angelo Russell. I'm just not a big believer in him as like a winning style basketball player. But if you're really desperate for like point guard help, I think that could be an option for them. Last team I want to talk about here is the Blazers. It just hasn't looked good on the court for them, and off the court, it's been even worse. They let the GM go last week for personal conduct issues. It looked like, from what I saw, intimidation, bullying, profanity-laced tirades, all of which turned the Trailblazers front office into a toxic work environment. So that's not great. It sounds like Damian Lillard, from what I read in the offseason, wasn't super pleased with the Chauncey Billups hire. And it just hasn't looked good on them. They don't look like they're having fun out there. It just looks really uninspired at times. And Damian Lillard is having a really down year. He's missing some time due to an abdominal issue right now, which is concerning, especially being a smaller guard beyond 30. They tend to fall off a cliff, production wise, if we look at league history. I don't think that's going to be the case with Dame. I think we've got a couple more good seasons with him, but it is cause for concern. Right now, 40% field goals, 30% threes, averaging 22 a game. So scoring way down for him. The free throw, the new fouling rules probably has a lot to do with the scoring issues. But shooting efficiency wise, I chalk it up more to a slump than anything. I don't think it's, a lot of the shots he's getting are good shots, and shots that we've seen him make in past years, just not knocking him down as much this year. So I think that'll change. CJ McCollum is kind of, the other major trade chip they have. And he's been, as we've seen every single year, of his career, with the exception to the beginning where he wasn't getting a lot of minutes, but, this prime version of CJ, his production has been on the level it usually is, low 40s in terms of field goal percentage, 40-ish threes, and about 20 points a game. The league right now is it's kind of like a dam being held together with like a piece of bubble gum. Like, everybody is just kind of waiting for the Dame situation to resolve one way or another. And, if he were to demand a trade, which it doesn't look like he's going to, that would kind of open up the floodgates for trades for every team across the league. Everybody kind of wants to trade for Dame, and they're holding on to their assets to possibly make a run at him if he were to become available. Also, as I had kind of mentioned a couple of times throughout this podcast, the league this year, a ton of parity. There are very few teams that are just outright tanking or completely out of it. So with everybody kind of looking to buy and like try and compete this year, it's just tougher to find trades because there's just not a ton of teams that are selling off veterans right now. Everybody's kind of looking for that. This morning, right before I started recording, it looks like Dame is like enticed by the idea of playing with Ben Simmons, and that's kind of the obvious trade for them that fixes a lot of their problems, or helps them at least. Because right now with the Dame, CJ, and Nurkic core, they're just never going to be a good defensive team, and that's kind of been the problem this year as well. Ben Simmons being, one of the best defensive players in the league, he's going to, turn them into a much better defensive team just by being on the court. He can cover up for some of Nurkic's liabilities. You could put him on a guard to, take the pressure off of Dame to have to chase a guard around, your Steph Curry's and whatnot. They just don't have a defensive stopper right now that they can go to, and it shows in their defensive numbers. It's time to get desperate for them, though. If they're going to make the Damian Lillard thing work, or if they're not, it's time to make the moves now. We've seen the Dame, CJ, Nurkic core, and it just, they had a couple of puncher's chances at making, it to the finals. I think they had a couple of conference finals, but they ran into the Warriors when they were in their heyday. So it's time to get desperate. And then on the flip side, if they're looking to just completely tear this thing down, blow it up, I think the sooner you trade Damian Lillard, the better. You don't want these production issues. If they do persist, his trade value is going to steeply decline. I think right now is, when you're going to be able to capitalize and get the most bang for your buck if you were going to cash him in and just rebuild this thing. I don't know. And as far as the Ben Simmons thing, if you were to trade CJ for Ben Simmons, I don't know if Philly is doing that unless you're throwing in like a ton of draft picks. I think that, Philly is trying to hold out for Damian Lillard, but if he's not going to be available, I think Philly should be interested in CJ McCollum. I think that's kind of what they're looking for in a player, a guy who they can run the offense through a little bit. Tyrese Maxey has been awesome for them this year, as has Seth Curry. At times he's looked like Steph Curry this season, but I still think like a scoring option for them at the guard spot specifically could be a really good fit for them. For the Ben Simmons thing, if you are trading for him, and this any team, Blazers included, I think what you're buying into is like if you're building the team around him, like if you're one of these tanking teams or a team like the Blazers, if they were to deal Dame Lillard, what you're basically hoping for is that, the style of team that they built around Giannis, where it's just a bunch of shooters and Giannis is able to freely operate in the paint. That's what would work for Ben Simmons. Or if you keep Dame Lillard and you do the CJ for Simmons deal, he's like an overqualified Draymond Green at this point, like skill set wise. And as far as him not attempting threes, I think in the Draymond role specifically, alongside Embiid, it's a problem. Like when you've got a really awesome center like Joel Embiid, it's a problem for Simmons to not be attempting threes and to not be a threat from outside. But if you pair him with Damian Lillard, it's not as big of a problem. Teams with the Warriors, they're sagging off of Draymond Green and letting him take threes pretty much at his leisure. And he takes some, and he makes a few here and there, not really enough to scare the defense. So what's the difference between, a team willing to let Draymond Green shoot and him shooting a couple than Ben Simmons not taking those threes, or, making, if he does decide that he's going to shoot threes, maybe he doesn't make that many, but I just don't see the difference between those two scenarios. I guess the defense is kept a little bit more honest by the Draymond shooting, but it seems like most teams that play them are just completely uninterested and don't even make an effort to contest his shots. So yeah, you like if you were to trade for Simmons and he's like your second option offensively, like you're basically getting a Draymond Green, an awesome defender, really great playmaker, except Simmons can attack the basket a lot better than Draymond can at this stage in his career. Obviously the big deal breaker for like the Warriors piece specifically when they were thinking about Simmons is Draymond has all the intangibles, great leadership, really cares. Sometimes we don't see that from Simmons, and he is just the opposite of a leader. So that's another problem with trading for Simmons is you just don't know what you're getting with him at this stage. I mean, you're hoping for the best, but like skill set wise, like Draymond Green or maybe like a really, really, really poor man Giannis is kind of what you're getting with him. I think Draymond Green is a better comparison than Giannis, but um like that's like your best case scenario for trading for him. And like I kind of mentioned, I think that's a good fit for Portland. Norman Powell can kind of slide into the shooting guard spot, which is, I think he would be more comfortable there. You got Simmons, Covington, and Nurkic, and then if you deal Nurkic for like a Christian Wood or something, that could really, all of a sudden you're a lot more flexible with your lineups. And then even if you don't deal Nurkic, you got Larry Nance over there who can play some small ball five if you really want to get crazy. Yeah, as I kind of mentioned, there's just not a ton of teams out there who are looking to really trade. The only teams that I think that are really just outright tanking, like came into this season intentionally looking to be bad, are the Pistons, Magic, Thunder, and Rockets. And from those teams, there's not really a ton of tradable assets that teams would be interested in. Like there's not a ton of veterans on any of those rosters that are like, obvious trade deadline type deals. You got Eric Gordon, who I think is excellent 3-point shooter. He can still get to the basket and get you some buckets every now and again. Obviously not like he did, 5, 6, 7 years ago, but still really solid option. I mean, that'd be a good trade chip for somebody. He's on a higher contract, so I don't know. It might be tough to make the finances work for that. Christian Wood, another piece, I kind of mentioned him earlier. He's making about $14 million a year, so a lot easier to trade for that type of contract. And you get 2 years with him. You would have to give up probably a pretty fair amount of draft picks to make that happen. And then from the Magic, there's Terrence Ross, 6-man type player, instant offense off the bench type guy. I guess you could throw Gary Harris on an expiring contract for the Magic into that mix, but I don't really know that a ton of teams are viewing him as a really great asset or a guy that's going to really change anything for your roster. I don't even know if he makes a rotation for like a really competitive team. And then for OKC, I can't imagine them trading Lou Dort or Shea at this stage, but that's really all they've got trade chip wise. Maybe Derek Favors, but I don't know that any teams are really super interested in him. Kind of the unintentional tanking teams are like potential sellers at the deadline. The Pelicans, they're really bottoming out this year, but I still think David Griffin thinks this is a winning roster, and I have no idea what they're doing over there. Also did a video on them kind of discussing this whole botched season and the Zion situation. So maybe they, change course again with their franchise and decide that they're a seller. They're last place in the West right now, so I could definitely see that. They've got some pieces, that you could trade. Devontae Graham, Josh Hart, if they really wanted to shake things up. Brandon Ingram is there, but I can't see them trading him. I honestly don't see them doing anything. The Pacers are a really enticing team. They got the center combination, Sabonis and Turner. Brogdon, who would probably be kind of on the block, has just signed an extension, and the way they signed it, he can't be traded this season at all. So we won't see him moved. Karis LeVert is a guy that they could move. And then TJ Warren, if he ever comes back from that foot injury, another guy that could be on the move if Indiana decides to tear this thing down, which I think they should. I mean, it's clear that this group is not going anywhere. Last time we saw them, they made the play-in last year and won their first game, but didn't make the playoffs. And then the year before in the bubble, no Sabonis, so I'll give them that, but they were like a fifth seed, I think, and swept in the first round. So I think we've kind of seen the best of what we're going to see from the current core of this team, and they can commit to one of the centers, but I think the 2-center thing with Sabonis and Turner, it's just not working. So like, let's move on. Let's try something else. They can get a decent haul for either of those guys. Obviously, more so, I think, at least for Sabonis than Turner. But we'll see what they decide to do there. And then they have a good rookie in Duarte, who's been a lot better than I thought he was going to be. He can do a lot more than just 3 and D, which is kind of the way that he was pitched during like draft time stuff. He can score off the dribble. He can do some things. I think you could build around him in kind of the meantime while you hit the reset button on this thing if they decide to just completely have a fire sale and tear this whole thing down. He is an older rookie, so he's already 24, 25, I think. So yeah, you're kind of on a different timetable with him, but he's still a good young player to build around. As I kind of mentioned, don't really see the Pelicans doing anything. I still think David Griffin thinks this is a winning team, so we'll see what they do. The Kings are who I talked about last week. I think they're looking to deal Buddy Hield and Marvin Bagley. I think they would be happy to do that, whether they're rebuilding or not. If they do decide to tear it down completely, you could add De'Aaron Fox and Harrison Barnes to that mix. Barnes, a really good 3 and D wing, can score a little bit, beyond just shooting threes. So that would be a really excellent piece for a lot of teams. The Blazers are a team that would really be interested in something like that. And, the Heat, but I don't think they can make it work unless they throw Duncan Robinson in that deal. And I'm not sure I'm willing to do that, even though he struggled this year. And then De'Aaron Fox, they could get a king's ransom for that. No pun intended. Yeah, I'm not super sold on De'Aaron Fox being like a franchise level player. As I kind of mentioned last week, I think the best comp for him is Monte Ellis, which is a really good player, like an all-star caliber guy. I don't know that Monte Ellis ever made an all-star game, but kind of in the mix for that. And then De'Aaron Fox has kind of been in the mix for all-star honors throughout his, particularly last season. Didn't end up making it, but I wouldn't be surprised to see him make a couple of all-star teams. I think if he's your second or third option, I think you're pretty happy with that. So lightning quick point guard. I think a lot of teams would be wanting to add that even at a max contract spot. But yeah, I mean, as far as the play-in games, just in general, it's been a success. I mean, you've got a lot less teams just outright tanking. Everybody feels like they're in the mix. And, even when, before, if you were in the 11th or 12th spot, you're like, well, we're out of it. We may as well just, tank and blow this thing up. Now, if you're in that 11th or 12th spot in your conference, like you're still in the mix to make a play-in game. And, if you make the play-in, you only got to win, as a 10th or 11th seed. I'm sorry, is that right? Yeah, 10th or 11th seed, you just got to win 2 games and then you're into the actual playoffs. So, and for a team like the Kings or the Timberwolves, who really haven't had a lot of success with that, with making the playoffs at all, Kings haven't made it since 2006, I think, if I remember correctly from last week. Minnesota made it under the Jimmy Butler group, but before that, it was when Garnett was there. So not a ton of playoff action for them either. It keeps them in the mix and makes them feel like, they need to remain competitive and maybe make some moves to improve the team rather than just being like a farm system for all of the, typical teams that we see in the playoffs. Yeah, I think as far as the trade deadline goes, it's either going to be an absolutely insane trade deadline where like everything is being moved around, or we're going to see nothing happen. I think there's going to be no in between. I don't think there's going to be like, a handful of deals or like a moderately crazy trade deadline. It's just going to be absolutely bonkers where we see guys like Ben Simmons getting moved, maybe Damian Lillard, or we're barely going to see any deals made. Either way, this has been a super exciting year. I'm really enjoying the parity. I know the league may not like that as much ratings wise, but for an NBA fan and for a basketball fan, having like, the bulk of the league be really competitive and be fighting for playoff positioning, just really exciting stuff.